Mr. Joel Skousen, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Alex. It's very good to be with you.
People like you have been completely accurate about the Russian threat and basically, in extension, the threat coming from China and North Korea and so forth. Why is it, Mr. Skousen, that today we see a lot of the American alternative media and the patriots? Why are so many of them nowadays so soft on Russia? Why do we see them even promoting Russia or the Russian point of view concerning all kinds of topics?
Well, that's a very good question, Alex. Part of it has to do with the fact that when the Western media covered for what I call the phony fall of the Soviet Union, and it was a carefully crafted deception, communism never fell, it simply went underground and pretended to be dead in order to gain a great deal of aid and trade with the West to prepare for its future, attack on the West, which is still coming. But in the process of the Western media covering for the phony fall of the Soviet Union, and I mean, you had to cover it, I watched it go down, and I saw immediately through the holes in the argument that the KGB, the all-powerful KGB, would suddenly fail to capture Gorbachev in his undefended villa, and that the Leipzig riots in Germany would suddenly be allowed to go forward. And we now know that Erich Honecker said on his deathbed in Chile that he got orders from Moscow to allow the Leipzig riots to go forward. So this was a carefully crafted deception, but they gave credit to Ronald Reagan for it. So in America, the conservatives thought, oh, we won. The left isn't crucifying our hero Ronald Reagan anymore. They're giving him credit. Well, Ronald Reagan was just as surprised as anyone else at the phony fall of the Soviet Union. He didn't realize it was phony, and most of the conservatives in the United States today don't realize it's phony. They revel in the fact that communism fell, but it did not. And so the enemy then became globalism. And globalism is a real enemy. I think there are three independent predator centers in the globe, in the world, the Anglo-American globalists, the Russians, and the Chinese. And they're each trying to establish their own version of the New World Order under their control. Now, so people like Paul Craig Roberts, who generally I have a great deal of respect for, but he has become obsessed with the fact that if the globalists were trying to insert themselves in the Ukraine, then Russia is the victim. And so this mentality that Russia's the victim, or that Putin is somehow the only one who can stand up to the New World Order, and therefore he's our hero, is very much misplaced analysis, and it's very erroneous. I pointed out in my World Affairs Brief, for example, that only the Russians could have created the Ukrainian coup. Everyone in the West, especially in the United States, talks about how the U.S. poured $5 billion into Ukraine and influenced the independence movement, and that it was a pro-Western coup. But it was not. I was probably the only one in the United States to point out
as far as I've seen, yes.
Only the pro-Russian forces could have told the Berkut, the state secret police, to stand down and let the protesters win. Only the pro-Russian forces could have instructed the Party of Regions, who controlled the Rada, which is the parliament in Ukraine, to oust their own leader.
And isn't this a repetition of what we've seen with the so-called fall of the Soviet Union, where this big colonial superpower, Russia, with one continuous landmass, when in those satellite states like Ukraine, you had like the fall of the Soviet government there, the Moscow-controlled government there, and then all these new faces, or seemingly new faces, appeared and said, oh, we're going to create these new political parties, and we're going to be up for a vote. And then you saw kind of this, okay, the Russians, they pull out their tanks, but they leave the KGB net there. And I've seen that with Germany as well, and our current chancellor, in the middle of the 1980s, she was just a chemist or a physicist, and suddenly she was being positioned right when the Gorbachev thing happened in the background, when it started. in these high-level meetings. And then she started, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, she went into these KGB-controlled new groups in Eastern Germany, and then made her way up. So is this basically a repetition in Ukraine where, one guy is removed, one unpopular guy is removed, like Yanukovych, and then you see these fresh faces supposedly taking power, but it seems like just a rehash.
Well, it is. It's even deeper than having KGB moles, for example. Almost all of the leaders that surfaced after the fall of the Soviet Union, such as Lech Walesa in Poland or even Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, turned out to be Russian agents. And that's very much was in the news in Poland. When I visited Poland after the fall, I was surprised at how many Poles knew that Lech Walesa was a Russian agent all the time that he was running Solidarity. So in Ukraine, for example, Yulia Tymoshenko always has this aura of being pro-Western, but in fact, she played very seamlessly with Putin, and she didn't. And one of the telling things about the former Soviet satellite states is that none of the new presidents who are supposedly pro-Western ever purged the bureaucracy of the corrupt communist elements that were there. They continued to have their corrupt control, even in Ukraine. And that's why most of the Ukrainians don't like either side, the pro-Western or the pro-Russian, because they realize that nothing changes in Ukraine. It's still the same old cronies that are controlling things in the government.
Now, after the government plane crash, the Polish presidential plane in Smolensk, we expected a big outcry of Western governments. We expected a big outcry in the media, mainstream media and alternative media, but there was this big silence. So you didn't see protests from Western governments when the Polish elite was apparently killed a few years ago. I think it was 2010. You didn't see the mainstream media making a big deal out of it, and the alternative media did not make a big deal out of it. So where do you see this event, and what do you think of the reaction in the alternative media?
Well, occasionally, even though, for example, in Russia, they control all the major opposition parties, the Communist Party underground has an above-ground faction which controls about 20% of the votes. But they control United Russia, they control all the other opposition parties, except the smallest ones. In Poland, for example, what happened is that occasionally you do get a true anti-Soviet free market person elected, which is what happened, and so he had to be killed. When the Russians don't, in fact, undermine any of these leaders, then you pretty well know they're probably in the Russian pockets. I mean, it's just like after Ceausescu was ousted and killed in Romania because he wouldn't step down. He refused Moscow's orders, unlike Honecker.
He was shot.
Yeah, he was shot. And then Iliescu, who had supposedly defected a couple of or 6 months earlier in order to position himself as a pro-Western anti-communist. When I talked to the Romanians after Iliescu came to power, they said, oh, he's just an old communist. He's not a pro-Western free market guy. And they were absolutely correct. So the Soviets are really playing this. Poroshenko today in Ukraine, all of his best friends are Russian oligarchs. He has seamless relationships with Moscow. The fact that he's supposedly in opposition to Russia is just a fraud. For example, he promised in his campaign that everyone would be able to speak their preferred language in any sector of Ukraine, including the Russians. And then when he got elected, he said, no, you all got to speak Ukrainian. In other words, he was purposely setting it up so that the pro-West or the pro-Russian forces in Ukraine would have an excuse to hate the government. He sent in mercenaries who did ruthless drive-by shootings in Ukraine. He did everything to sabotage the view in the east of Ukraine of the Western, pro-Western government as evil. And so I see them still actually playing both sides and poisoning their own people against the supposedly pro-Western government.
Now then we have this big concept of Eurasia. Now in the view of the influential Russian figures and thinkers like, or extremists like Alexander Dugin, this Eurasia is just a big fascist, weird state, like stretching from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Now in before this Ukraine crisis, like up until a few months ago, there's been a lot of talk in political circles in Europe about a different kind of Eurasia, meaning an integration of the European Union and Russia. We saw the Van Rompuy from the European Union talking about, we need this cooperation. So they kind of sold this to politicians and, not to the public as well, but not in a big extent yet. They were selling this idea of a nice version of Eurasia, where you have a free trade zone between Russia and Europe. Then we had big newspapers in Germany printing the Vladimir Putin's call for this type of integration, meaning a free trade zone, no more visa necessary for travel between Russia and Europe. And I always said, wait a minute, this is completely insane, because if you have free travel, there's no protection against Russian agents anymore. And also all companies in Europe would be vulnerable. They would have their patents stolen. They would have their intellectual property stolen. And so this so-called nice version of Eurasia, that was promoted for a long time. And was this basically, in your opinion, kind of the excuse to facilitate the help for Russia, all the financial credit, the technological help, military goods that were sold to Russia, stuff that people have been warning about, but apparently the argument was, hey, we want this peaceful integration with the European Union and Russia, and so we're not going to criticize Russia no matter what they do.
Well, it's my answer has to be necessarily complex, because there are two factions trying to help the Russians. The first is the Anglo-American establishment, the globalists, as we call them, and they're trying to help Russia not because they're Marxist, but because they're trying to build an enemy to eventually attack the West. That's why they brought Mao to power in 1949. It was George Catlett Marshall and the U.S. globalists who brought him to power by cutting off aid to Chiang Kai-shek. They brought the Russians to power. The United States financiers gave $20 million in gold to Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. They undermined the White Russians when they tried to go to war against the Red Army. They gave Russia the first enriched uranium to build their nuclear weapons, shipped it from the United States to Russia so that Russia could do a nuclear weapon within a year after World War II. So you see, we've been bringing communist governments to power, but not because Anglo-American globalists are communists, but because they're trying to build an enemy, and I'll explain the end game of that. But in Europe, you have a slightly different situation. You have the Socialist International, which became very powerful after World War II. This was essentially a Moscow front, masquerading as socialist, but they were working for Moscow. And as you know, during Brandt's regime in Germany, he had several Soviet spies working for him. Angela Merkel's a former communist now. Tony Blair was a Marxist in Britain, for example.
The new head of NATO, this Norwegian guy, he was with the socialists in Norway. What's his name again? The new head of NATO. He just stepped in a few days. He just stepped up a few days ago to the into this position. Jens Stoltenberg, I think is his name, and
the key point, Alex, is that They appear to switch to the globalist position when they get into the EU. Tony Blair, when he became, during the Gulf War, he switched to becoming a raving globalist. And Angela Merkel seems to be playing along, but we never know because these people are very skilled at playing both sides, and they can play up to the globalist and yet still be reporting back to Moscow. We really don't know. It is very difficult to know who's who, whether or not they're real just socialists or whether or not they're actually taking orders from Moscow. So many of the people promoting Eurasian integration in Europe are Moscow-driven agents. Others are just globalists. Right now, their purposes are aligned together, boosting Russia, protecting Americans and Europeans from knowing that Russia is really a threat. But they will diverge at some point, and that will happen when I believe, and Russia and China are clearly trying to build the latest state of weapons of mass destruction, even as Europe and the United States are disarming in terms of nuclear weapons. I think what the globalists intend to do by building Russia and China is to induce them eventually to go through with their long-planned nuclear strike on American and British nuclear forces. And what does this accomplish? Well, in terms of globalism, the globalists know that there is increasing resistance to EU integration. You saw in the past election how much opposition there is to further EU powers. A return to sovereignty. In America, we see the same thing with the Tea Party resisting more global integration. And for that reason, the globalists know they're going to have to give us a war that will panic or force people into a panic to accept a militarized version of the global government, which we do not now have. We got the United Nations as a result of World War II, but it basically had no military powers, has no financial powers, no taxing powers. Eventually, the globalists want to have global military power, global taxation, and a global currency, and you can't get there without a global government, and you can't get there, at least as far as Americans are concerned, unless you have
a global enemy, big-sized enemy.
Big size. And the interesting thing is, by inducing a nuclear strike on American forces, and that's part of the reason for intervening in the Middle East, is to build this reputation of the U.S. and NATO as the bully of the world. They are handing China and Russia the excuse to attack and take down the bully of the world. But you see, the Chinese and Russians don't intend to attack civilian targets in either the United States or Europe, only military targets. Then they intend to blackmail the West into submission. But our globalist leaders come out of their deep underground bunkers and say, the Russians and Chinese deceived us. But now that the American military has been decapitated, and probably UK missiles will be hit as well, now that the American military has been decapitated, the world cannot defend itself unless we join together and form a global military power. And I think it'll be based around NATO. I think that's one of the reasons why they created ISIS as the new international terror threat, to have an excuse to create a new military force, which you're seeing. They went to extreme ends to try to build and cobble together a military strike force, even though the U.S. was perfectly capable of doing it all themselves. I think they're using international terror as the excuse to build the predecessor to this global military, to condition people to get used to having a global military do their bidding.
Now, first, do you think that the American establishment has already given up Europe? They have positioned themselves so Europe will be taken by the Russians?
No, I don't. I, in fact, think that they're going to use the basis of NATO as the core of the new global military. Now, I happen to have some information that the U.S. has a lot of secret weapon systems that are capable of deterring a Russian-Chinese preemptive strike, but they will not use them until after the first strike falls on American military forces. Then they will use them And I think a lot of those secret weapons are space-based anti-missile systems that can then stop for a period of time Russian and Chinese nuclear attacks while the West regroups. I do think there will be a land invasion by Russia. They will take back the former Soviet states, and they will get into the eastern portions of Europe. I don't know exactly how far, but I do think that they will not take all over Europe, and the globalists don't intend to yield all of Europe, but to get everyone together to fight.
Yeah, because ultimately Russia needs Western Europe technology. I mean, they still have these problems, and a lot of the Russian military production takes place in Ukraine, and then we've seen that when the Soviet Union fell, they had this large gap in technology and parts and pieces, and that's why the Western establishment delivered these parts and pieces, these necessary parts and pieces to Russia to build them up. Now, in this strategy...
Before you go on, Alex, just let me interject here. One of the ways in which I think the West intends to win this war, even after absorbing a nuclear first strike on American military forces, is sometimes during the progress of the war, I think they're going to cut a deal with China to betray Russia in exchange, like we did with Russia to give all this aid to Russia. I think China will accept that same deal, and then Russia cannot win if the Chinese are at their back door. But I think that in the course of the war, the beginning part of the war, China, who has a grudge match with Japan, will conquer Japan all the way down through Australia and perhaps New Zealand in order to protect this buffer zone in the east for her before she switches sides and attacks Russia on the Eastern Front. And then Russia, of course, cannot win a two-front war any more than Hitler did.
Yes, and in this strategy, the Western establishment could not just then defeat this big enemy in the East, they also could defeat their enemies at home, meaning the patriots, meaning the pro-constitution people of the United States and maybe in Europe. Because right now, if those critical of the New World Order, the Western New World Order, if those critical switch, pledge allegiance to Russia and think Russia is the big hope, I mean, wouldn't it be possible in the future for, say, the U.S. government designating a lot of these patriots as enemy combatants or foreign agents, Russian agents, if they now position themselves like like a lot of them are doing?
Well, let me explain. I have a little bit different view on how I think that's going to play out. I think that the American patriots who mistakenly view Putin as their salvation against the New World Order will immediately disavow that position when Russia and China have a nuclear strike on America. No one in America will take a pro-Russia position. But what will happen is the globalists, and that's the reason for NSA surveillance, the globalists are surveilling all content, not just metadata. They're building lists on dissidents. That's why they put out disinformation like DHS buying 2 billion bullets. That just didn't happen, but they put it out there so they can track the emails of who gets upset, who passes these emails on, and it helps them to build these lists. So I think at some time during the war, when communications are reestablished, because it will start with an EMP strike, which will take down communications and all traffic and electricity in the U.S. and will cause a great deal of panic. But after things start to knit back together, I think the globalists will say, there are people among our midst who are not supporting our troops, who think that we are responsible for this war, that we were responsible for 9/11, which is true, by the way. 9/11 was a government operation from beginning to end, and we have the proof of that. But I think they'll have what we call a test oath of allegiance, or a new citizenship of the world. Mm-hmm. In other words, saying that we want to make sure that everyone comes on board. So we're going to have a new citizenship. We pledge allegiance to the world government, and anyone who won't take this pledge,
or won't respond to the draft.
That's right, or respond to the draft. And so I think that's how they'll isolate patriots by the issue of conspiracy, and they'll call upon Americans and Europeans to turn in to the authorities those that believe in conspiracy, and it will be a hallmark for dissidents in the future.
Now, in the past couple of months, we've seen parts of the alternative media in the West basically just copying and pasting Russian news stories. Most of the time, fake news stories or heavily distorted news stories concerning the downing of the flight MH17, concerning the fights in Ukraine, concerning basically whether or not Russia has the right of the right to occupy Ukraine, because there's this ridiculous argument that Ukraine belongs to Russia. Now, in all these cases, you've seen fake news stories, propaganda news stories being copied and pasted, and that has kind of permeated the alternative media in the West. How competent do you think Western alternative media is, or maybe how maybe wishful thinking plays a part in that when they say, well, maybe Russia isn't that bad and we need to support them?
Well, the art of disinformation has become extremely complex now. The government in the United States especially has a full-time team of disinformation experts at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida who do nothing but troll the internet, pretending to be conservatives and to place false information. And their purpose is to get conspiracy theory discredited by seeding the field with a lot of bogus theories so that the rational people just throw out all conspiracy theory. One of the ways in which they distort real truth is called the false forgery. In other words, they will forge a document that contains truth confirming a conspiracy, and then 2 days later the media will announce that it was a forgery, and they get people then to say, well, therefore the content we have to throw out as well as the source of the document. And that's how they get content destroyed in the United States, by creating these false forgeries. And so we have to be very careful of what I call too good to be true information. And the alternative media, in answer to your question directly, is not very good at discerning too good to be true false information. They get suckered in all the time, and part of that is because they're so anxious for proof that the government is going to implement martial law next week, that it's very easy for disinformation experts posing as members of Department of Homeland Security or military saying, I just heard that there's going to be a takedown of dissidents, or I just heard that the military is going to overthrow Obama in 2 weeks. And I've been one of those on the internet, the alternative media leaders who have basically tried to point out why those are false. And I will make my case here that with a total surveillance society, Alex, NSA eavesdropping, and there's no way anyone in government can leak every week to people like Alex Jones or Steve Quayle or Doug Hagman with insider and not get shut down. And there's just no way you can do that. They would be able to track it. And so these people are permitted leaks. They're purposely feeding false information in order to get the conservative side of the alternative media discredited.
And so another factor that plays into this, I think, is the competition between media outlets, because nowadays a story has to be viral. It has to be quick. It has to be, as you said, it has to sound too good to be true evidence, like this smoking gun, whatever you might want to call it, because as we've seen time and again, a badly cobbled together video online about MH17 or the Ukraine thing or whatever, or how Putin is going to save us all, a sloppy video can get 10 million views in a few weeks. And so I think that even some of the better outlets in the alternative media, they think they're kind of in a position where they have to compete unless they get overtaken by some of these amateurs. And do you think that's part of this?
Oh, very much so, and especially because certain outlets like Dave Hodges or even Alex Jones has a considerable reputation for imminent threat, of hyping imminent threat. And when it doesn't happen, they are eager to look for someone who will provide a news story, energetic, full of hype, that will say that I wasn't really wrong, it's just been postponed. And so week after week, you get the latest and strongest story about imminent threat to the constitutional conservatives by government. And most of it's false. You have to look at the long-term agenda. And that's why I have tried to explain my position to people all over the world. There has to be a reason, Alex, why our own government has been taking over 100 years to build both the Soviet Union, Russia, and China as these two major enemies, giving them technology, using Israel to funnel technology to China, which they do all the time.
Yeah, opening doors like Bush Sr. did when he was the unofficial U.S. ambassador to communist China. I mean, he later said that China would have been isolated for decades to come if it wasn't for me.
That's exactly right. I mean, people like Henry Kissinger, who gave the Russians the miniature ball-bearing technology that they didn't have to MIRV their missiles, or to make multiple independent reentry vehicles. That's called MIRV. And they didn't have it. They couldn't develop the technology. And so Kissinger authorized during the Nixon, a conservative Republican administration, to give the Russians the power to create multiple warheads. So we're building the best enemies that money can buy. And there has to be a reason, Alex, for that. And that's why I say these people who say there's going to be an economic collapse next week, or they've been saying it forever, 2010, they don't understand the globalist agenda. If they were to pull the plug on the economy, everybody would know who to blame.
Exactly.
They know who would cut the money supply. But if you look at what the globalists have been trying to do for decades in building up these enemies, they're going to use those enemies to create a war that will wipe down all opposition. I mean, there just won't be anybody willing to stand up to the issue of a global military force, a global currency, if there's a nuclear war.
Now, in Germany, we've seen some pretty significant signs that the days of Chancellor Angela Merkel are numbered. There have been candidates groomed to surpass her, and one of these candidates was a man called Zu Guttenberg. You know, he came out of nowhere. I mean, his family, they are, they have aristocratic titles. They've been around for a while, but politically, this guy was unknown. Suddenly, there was him in the media, and of course, the European media follows what these American organizations tell them. Basically, this Atlantic connection. And so this man was groomed as the new chancellor, and they gave him the post of defense minister. Gave him all this news coverage. Oh, look, it's him in doing a visit in Afghanistan, visiting the troops. And I thought he is like the exact opposite of Angela Merkel, because first of all, he's clearly someone who is aligned with the American establishment. He's someone who has ties to the military. Something he had this defense minister position, and he's also with an aristocratic title. He's supposed to be rooted in Germany, and so then of course there was a scandal because his doctoral thesis was apparently a copy and paste job, and now they have a new person they groom, von der Leyen. She's defense minister right now, and she's of course a Western globalist. She has also an aristocratic title, and of course she has a tie into the military. Now, what do you think is going to be? Will we see in Germany and in the United States? Will we see kind of the end of these Marxist heads of state like Obama and Angela Merkel? Will we see kind of these new Ronald Reagan types, who say a lot of good things, but not necessarily do a lot of good things? What do you think is going to be, what is going to be the next president like, or the new chancellor in Germany like?
Well, that's a very good analysis. We have seen this much more openly in the United States. For example, in 2008, you had a candidate in the United States, Mitt Romney, who inserted himself because he had his own money enough to finance his own campaign. He bent over backwards to please the establishment. He hired all of the Council on Foreign Relation advisors that every other controlled candidate does, but he wasn't controlled. But he was trying so hard to please the establishment that you thought, well, maybe they'll accept him, but they didn't. They resurrected, as you said, out of nowhere, 5 new candidates, one after another. They generated false push polling, we call it. That is, you generate a false poll to show he's suddenly got 40% name recognition. He's the up-and-coming person, and then he fell by the wayside in the first primary election. It became obvious that the polls were false. They resurrected another one. They did this 5 times with various candidates to try to defeat Romney. And when they couldn't, they finally had to fudge and distort the actual vote. They made 8 million U.S. votes disappear at a minimum in order to get Obama elected. But remember, Obama, in our particular case, is no longer a Marxist. At some point, he was bought out by the globalist and became a globalist. You don't make Marxist wealthy. He's worth over $14 million
yes,
now.
But to the public, he's still a leftist figure. And
yes,
will he be surpassed by a Ronald Reagan type figure?
He will. In fact, the powers that be in the United States read the political tea leaves, if you will, and they've determined there's so much hostility towards Obama, we've got to reduce that hostility by giving them the appearance of a conservative. And so you'll have a false conservative rise up, whether it's George Bush or, they wanted Chris Christie, who has a lot of skeletons in his closet, very much a controlled person. And just as you saw in Germany with Gutenberg or, the von Leyen, these are people who are controlled conservatives who will, in fact, not do anything different. They will give conservatives the rhetoric. They may even talk tough on Russia, but they won't do anything to stop the shipment of the Mistral helicopter ships from France to Russia and those types of weapons transfers.
Yeah.
So,
Obama said those who still think about a Russian threat, they live in the past.
Yeah, and so they denigrate everyone who is preparing in the United States for nuclear war, and I do a lot to try to get people to be prepared individually. It's very telling that FEMA in the United States, the Federal Emergency Management Association, talks about food storage and everything, but they'll never talk about fallout shelters. They do not want Americans prepared, and the same thing in Europe, because they want us to have the maximum vulnerability so that when our leaders come out of their bunkers, and believe me, they've got new bunkers that are half a mile underground, and they're not building those because of terrorism.
Yeah, we've shown the footage.
When they come out of their bunkers, they want Americans to be in a panic so that they will accept whatever they hand them as the false solution.
Now, what do you think of this? Before we get to the topic of shelters, because that's a very interesting topic, and of course you're one of the leading experts on it. Because when this Scotland vote happened, we've been digging out some stuff about Alex Salmond in Scotland and his socialist past, and at some point the Scottish National Party, they tied themselves to these left-wing causes like nuclear disarmament and so forth, and they had these big marches denouncing the stationing of United Kingdom nuclear weapons in Scotland. And the argument was, well, if all these nukes are stationed here, the Russians will hit us in Scotland, and they said that, well, even if you have a shelter, you will be fried in your shelter because Scotland is so small. That's just a crazy anecdote out of this whole situation. Because in the United States, of course, shelters of different kinds, they have a much bigger tradition, or a much bigger. You see a lot more private bunkers. In Europe, you see a lot of government bunkers, especially in the mountains, like in Switzerland. But before we get to the topic of shelters, one more question for you about this development in North Korea. Now, in this scenario leading up to 2020, or maybe a couple of years afterwards, when the Russian military has gained in size and strength and technology, and the Chinese are buying and building stuff as well, you always said that North Korea would be the ideal Eastern nation to start off this avalanche of evil. Now we have seen kind of the leader of North Korea disappearing for a month, and there have been high-level visits from the north to the south. Do you think this is just some of these generals maybe wanting to become billionaires in a unified Korea? Or do you think that this is just a ploy in preparation of an all-out assault on the South, because the South obviously is a base of operations for America and NATO?
Well, it's a very good question. I have long postulated that, as you outlined, that North Korea is the most likely trigger event for World War III. And there has to be a reason, Alex, to explain why the U.S. has basically given North Korea a pass, meaning that there's no regime change required there. The military option is not on the table for North Korea, even though it's the most aggressive predator rogue nation in the world, or appearance of a rogue nation. It has nuclear weapons. It has the missiles to deliver those, even to Hawaii or parts of the United States. And yet we don't require regime change. We always look the other way when they violate the latest nuclear treaties. Contrast this with Iran, who I believe, yes, is trying to develop a nuclear weapon, but they're still a long ways away, and they don't have intercontinental ballistic missiles to deliver it. And yet we've been demanding regime change there since 2004. And it was, at least at that time, a fairly civilized, pro-Western country. And yet, what's the dichotomy about it? I think it's because the globalists know that China, which now controls North Korea, is going to use North Korea as the trigger event. So in order to be a good trigger, first of all, you've got to have an unstable country so that it can appear to be a rogue attack that isn't controlled directly by China. And the North Korean military, ever since Sung-il, the original grandfather of the Kim family, who
supposedly created the world, was born in Soviet territory, I believe.
That's right. But you see, I mean, he ran for 46 years North Korea with an iron hand, and he got the military into this hyped up posture of attack on the West is imminent, attack, or by the West is imminent, attack on South Korea is something we've got to train for. And so North Korea periodically, about every 6 months or so, attacks South Korea in some minor way. And I think they're doing this to keep South Korea's off balance so that they won't know when it's a real attack or whether or not it's just one of these smaller probing attacks. But as the various sons of Kim came into power for 17 years, and then now the grandson, Kim Jong-un, is in power, they have basically lost competency. In other words, other powerful figures are controlling things in North Korea, and China is ultimately tied to those military leaders and controlling them. They take orders from China. And so while they allow Kim to think that or Jong-un to think that he's a leader, there has been a lot of reshuffling, a lot of purging going on because there is a change going on. But let there be no doubt, China still has a strong hold. and it has basically given the orders to the people behind the scenes, do a peace offensive with South Korea. We've got several years before we're ready to attack. So we want a peace offensive so as to disarm South Korea, to disarm the West into thinking we're more benevolent. So I don't think anything is really changing, but I don't think Jong-un is, in fact, the true leader of North Korea anymore.
Well, I mean, he was, I think, second or third choice, because I think one of his brothers was caught in, I think, in Disneyland, and it caused a kind of a diplomatic embarrassment. But one more question about the United States, and I want to get into the topic of strategic relocation and personal shelters. Now, a question about Senator Rand Paul. Now, of course, in Europe, the media has largely been quiet about the two Pauls, and now the younger one, Rand Paul, he's been talking a lot about nuclear disarmament, and his father, Ron Paul, I think his Ron Paul Institute has been very soft on Russia. Is this kind of just this non-interventionist kind of core policy? They just want to, de-escalate things, or do you think maybe they are a bit misguided? Maybe they do think Russia has become a Christian conservative nation?
Well, I'm personal friends with Ron Paul, and I've talked to about this to him. He is a true libertarian, and he's a very strong anti-globalist. And he basically has been schooled for so long about the false warmongering agenda of the U.S. government of creating wars and intervention for other ulterior motives, that he's kind of taken the position philosophically that anyone who's an enemy of the globalists really isn't an enemy, must be a friend of ours. And so for that reason, he's soft on China. He does not realize that China and Russia are really true threats. And so it's an unfortunate thing, but he's totally sincere, hasn't seen a lot of the evidence and is resistant to it. But it's not like the various neocons, who are taking a position because of ulterior motives. So the Paul family is very sincere. I don't think the establishment's going to allow Rand Paul to get the presidency or the nomination, because even though he's bending over backwards like Mitt Romney to go along to a certain extent with the establishment, he's also not been compromised morally, and they cannot allow, and that's one of the reasons why they could not allow Mitt Romney to gain the White House.
It's harder to control.
You would see so much black operations in there, like Benghazi, that Mitt Romney would not have tolerated were he president, and they don't want to have to control them like they did Ronald Reagan with an assassination attempt. They want real good puppets in there, and neither Rand Paul in fact, the puppets have to have a lot of dirt. They have to have dirt on them so that they can blackmail them into submission.
So who do you think has a real shot at the White House?
Well, Rand Paul is the one the establishment will have to defeat, because he's the one who's got the strongest chance of joining conservatives, so they will have to defeat him. They've got another 4 or 5 people in the wings. They're going to try Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, but there's 4 or 5 other that will come out of nowhere, as you said. If the first 2 fail, or if Chris Christie fails, they'll bring them out of nowhere, and they'll do false push polling in order to convince people that these people are viable.
We've shown our audience parts of your presentation on video presentation interview on strategic relocation. So our audience is broadly aware that you favor the Intermountain West of the United States, and our audience is aware that, of course, you advise against densely populated areas, and our audience was, of course, most interested in what you had to say about Europe. Could you give people an overview of what to think of when they consider leaving their country emigrating to another country, when people want to position themselves, would it be wise to go to Spain, or would it be wise to try Switzerland? Would it be wise to just say, well, if I'm a conservative patriot, if I'm aware of all these issues, maybe it's smartest to just try to get into the United States or Canada?
Well, I do think that the United States and Canada, even though the United States will be subject to a nuclear strike, but it will be limited to military targets. So I think there's a great deal of wide open spaces in the West that would be good for anybody who can get here. Canada has even more wide open spaces. The problem with Canada is that its government is a yes man to the New World Order. They will do whatever the globalist government America dictates. So I suspect that dissidents will not be welcome in Canada as they were during the Vietnam War. But a lot of people can't get to the United States, and so let's talk a little bit about Europe. I've traveled extensively in Europe and know the countries pretty well. Traditionally, in wartime, Spain has been the country most distant from invasions from the east, and that remains so in the future environment with an invasion from Russia. And yet Spain is much more densely populated now. It's much more controlled by the EU. It's very likely to have a lot of controls against people escaping to Spain. It may not have that neutral aspect that it did during World War II. Austria and Switzerland, with its mountain areas, do provide the traditional safe haven if you have rural underground cabins or second homes there. And I emphasize, like the Swiss, that people need to have fallout shelters or safe rooms, and I also believe that they need to be concealed, because our own governments, being globalist or tied to the globalists, will probably go after, just like they've gone after Holocaust deniers in Europe. Someday conspiracy believers will be like Holocaust deniers, and they'll be hunted and I think perhaps locked up. So the Jews of World War III are going to be the conspiracy believers, and the conservatives who believe in sovereignty and constitutionalism and real strict adherence to religious values. And so I think it's important that people prepare to hide people, just like the story of Corrie ten Boom in Belgium hiding Jews. People need to prepare in advance for hidden rooms, hidden places, safe rooms that are concealed so that they can hide their stockpiles of food, because there will be famine someday during this next war. I think an EMP strike is likely to hit Europe as well, and so there could be a very real social panic in the major cities. So people do need to have their stockpiles secured in a place away from the cities, and need to prepare plans to get out of the cities to get to those safe places.
So what do you think about, because a lot of people tend to gravitate towards South America. I mean, but South America right now seems to be aligned with the BRICS empire, and there's a lot of activity down there, and I think even Chile now has a socialist government. It's pretty unstable. You know, things are shifting like every few decades. Is there any place you'd recommend in Latin America?
Well, there is, and I've lived in Latin America for several years. Before I leave Europe, though, let me just say that this, Norway and Sweden in the northern portion offer some of the best respites in Europe. I do believe that southern Sweden and Norway will be occupied by the Russians, just because they have to control the waters of the warm Baltic Sea that goes past Denmark, and so they're going to have to occupy those countries. But I don't think they'll get into the north in the cold areas where people can have retreats. In South America, for example, at least half of the countries now in South America are clearly communist and will align themselves with Russia and China during the next war. So I don't think expatriates will do very well in those countries. When suddenly the U.S. is decapitated militarily, it doesn't have any power over Latin America. They're going to say, all right, all you Americans or Europeans down here. Remember, when their tourism and their economies go to pot as well, They will then start to confiscate foreign bank accounts and even foreign properties as well. So I don't hold out Latin America as a good bet because of the lack of property rights law there, and the fact that there's a lot of Marxists being trained in the universities, they're in the government, they're in the elite, and I think there's going to be a hostility towards people who really believe in freedom. That said, Uruguay and Chile are still the best two countries in Latin America if you're going to seek a safe haven. Even though Uruguay is governed by the Frente Amplia, the Wide Front, which is a leftist organization, the current president is a very mild-mannered leftist who believes in a lot of freedom and liberty for people, and so you can find a lot in the interior of Uruguay. And Chile has a lot of rural country as well, where you can find a lot of friendly people. But you're going to have to know the language to go rural there.
Yes. Now, my wife told me that because she spent a couple of years in Latin America, she said that some prominent rich people, I think they've bought properties in Chile. I mean, some of the really wealthy people, and so when you drive through through some of their lands, of course you can drive through because of the roads, but you cannot really stop, because once you stop, you get a not so friendly visit from people in blacked out SUVs telling you to move on, please. So if people now in Europe think that, okay, I'm gonna buy maybe some cheap property in Spain, maybe in the south, or I'm gonna stay here in Europe where it's kind of rural and not so densely populated, and people think I also need a shelter. I need my own shelter. Now you're the expert on this. What do people need to look out for? Where can they go? How can people get their own shelter?
Well, in the United States, we have a lot of prefabricated shelters out of steel and fiberglass that are buried in the ground, and I don't recommend these. I'm glad you don't have these in Europe, because to have a big shelter on a truck come in with a crane and dig a hole and put it in your backyard, everybody in the neighborhood knows it's there. I prefer that shelters be exclusively done as part of basement space, underground, and sometimes under a car park, under a garage is one of the best places to put it, because no one expects there to be a basement under a garage.
And you can work in there without people seeing what's been done there.
That's right. And so you need to have an excuse that I'm just adding to the house, I'm building a basement. You end up pouring a concrete slab over that portion of the basement. Nobody thinks anything about that in Switzerland, because homes used to be required to have a shelter in there, though they weren't very big. I believe in a lot bigger shelters, just because it's not just safeguarding people from radiation. You've got to safeguard your supplies and your stockpiles from confiscation or from pillaging mobs of people. But basement space is the key, and you've got to have at least 12 inches, what is that, about a third of a meter of concrete over the top to shield against radiation. And you need to have ventilation that comes up into a house where you can hide the stacks, because if people put your ear to a ventilation pipe, you can hear everything that's being said in a shelter. So you want those ventilations to come out through the ceiling, like plumbing ventilation, or inside the attic space with your filters on it, so that you have filtered air coming into the shelter.
So if an American came to you and said, I need a shelter, what would you tell him, and what would you tell a European that comes to you and says, I need a shelter?
Well, we have a small design firm that designs high security residences and retreats, and we're extremely busy, as you say, so we wouldn't be able to do anything. But we do have a couple of books that tell how to do it yourself and how to design it. My big book is The Secure Home, and it's available on the internet. So it has the architectural drawings of how to do a shelter as a remodeling. We also have a book called The High Security Shelter Book, which talks about how to do a out of concrete block how to build a shelter in an existing basement. And I know there are many places in Europe that have existing basements, and it shows how to do that.